Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming and welcome to the second big event of our inaugural Diverse Imperial week. I hope you've had a chance to see the exhibition in the main hall of the main entrance hall of the college. It's really interesting. I think next year it should be twice as big, but this year it's a great start and it's very interesting and shows a lot about the college. Yesterday we focused on some issues that, as I've said to several people in the last 24 hours, we have never really talked about a lot in public before. We've talked about gender quite a lot in public in the college. We haven't talked about ethnicity and we haven't talked about sexuality very much until yesterday. So for me, I thought yesterday was the mark of two important first conversations, probably long overdue, but at least we've started talking about them. The objective of this week is to celebrate and give more visibility to the diversity of the people that make up this college. We come in all shapes, sizes, colours, nationalities, languages, sexualities, you name it, that's Imperial. And that's the strength and the richness of the college, that we are so wonderfully diverse. Today, we're going to change the focus a little bit and think about what we do here at Imperial. And today, we're going to be challenged to think about how we think about these issues in relation to our research agendas. And I'm delighted that our new Vice Provost for Education is going to talk to us about this. I know it's a subject that she's done a lot of work on, and we met before she came to college on this very subject, so we're lucky to have an expert. So Simone joined us this year. I don't know if everybody's had the chance to meet her yet, from the University of Leiden. She is by trade a physician and is actually an expert in child and maternal health. But today she's going to challenge us about our research. So Simone, I don't think I can still pronounce your name properly. So I'm going to say Simone, Vice Provost for Education, challenge us about our research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thanks for putting this event together and for being such an incredible engine behind bringing this whole topic to the attention at Imperial and unleashing a lot of the power that's already at this absolutely amazing university. I've been having a great time since August 1st, and I really like the fact that I can now talk about another one of my passions besides education, clearly, namely inclusivity, equality, and in this time from the perspective of knowledge production. So the title of my talk is Gendered Research and Inclusive Innovation. It could have also been Inclusive Research and Gendered Innovation. And gender is in there because a lot of the literature that we now draw from centers around gender inequality and also gendered research and innovation. But basically, I think it's very important to draw it much broader and make sure that we talk about inclusivity in the broader sense. Another reason also to look at gender still is that basically globally, I mean, women make up 50% of the global population, actually a little bit over 50% even. And globally, no matter what country, what continent, what culture, what predominant religion, women in every society are worse off than men. So I think it's important to realize that that's something that the whole world deals with. And so therefore gender in the title, but we're certainly not going to limit it to this. So I'm going to march you through quite a few topics in a bit of a high pace, because I really also want to have time to discuss with you afterwards. And I love a firm discussion and an open academic exchange about vision and values. So please don't be shy and challenge me or tell me how you feel. And let's make sure that after today, we'll take these topics forward, because that's really what it's all about. So when we talk about inclusivity and inequality, what is at the root of this? I think it's good to think about that just for a few minutes together. People humanity likes dividing ourselves up into boxes that are easily recognized, that make us feel safe. And one of the first things we do, sometimes even before birth, but very shortly after birth, is divide people up by gender. That's the most important factor that we all use. Are you a man or a woman? And of course that's a problem when you feel like you're neither man nor woman, but it's very predominant in this world. So we have pink and blue people, and incidentally, pink for girls and blue for boys is something that just came about 60 years ago, and longer ago was completely the other way around. So there's no sort of genetic predisposition in women that they really like pink, so just so you know it. So we divide the world up, and that gives us a sense of comfort. What of course happens when you divide the world up, especially when you do it dichotomously, is that as a person you need to fit into one of those boxes. So you clearly have to define whether you're pink or whether you're blue. And as if that's not bad enough, then we of course also ascribe all kinds of attributes to that particular box that we're in. And then we take it a step further and say, okay, so now I'm here, you're there, and I really don't understand your perspective very well, so I'm just going to look at the world from my perspective. And that's how we get ourselves in trouble big time. I'm not going to say bigly, but I almost did. So what happens in academia? This could be the academic maze for the average male person. It's quite complicated. You need to take all the right turns, and there are very easy ways to take the wrong turns. And at the end then of this maze, there's some prize, some position, maybe a full chair at Imperial College or something else that's very coveted. And when you're in there, and often when the maze, the walls are high enough, you don't really see the maze that other people go through. So it's very easy to assume that academics all go through a maze much like this one. And that when you make it to the end, it's clearly because you're the best and you're very good and you've done your work. And of course, academics work really hard, so that feeling is not unreasonable. But what happens then is if you're in a maze like this, you often don't realize that a maze for other people, in this example for pink people in academia, may look a little bit more like this. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble. And in universities, we often think that the system is very meritocratic. So if the people who are at the top actually came there through merit, they clearly must be the best. So the ones who don't make it to the top must somehow be qualitatively less. And of course, there's a lot of literature about that. So today, and then to make things worse, of course, there are not just two identities, no pink and blue. There are also lots of other identities, white and brown, so ethnicity, skin color, culture. Dorothy already mentioned sexuality, physical ability, religious background. There's so many identities that people can have. So it quickly becomes quite complicated, and there are lots of opportunities for othering, for looking at us versus them. And I think as a human race, we get ourselves into trouble doing that, and we're also getting ourselves into trouble at universities when we do that too much. So there's a lot of bias, and there's a lot of literature around bias, both in companies, in politics, in pretty much any sphere. But today we're talking about academia. There's a vast literature that there's bias in gender. There's a pretty large literature that we also bias by ethnicity. Social status is also an important one, which I find different in the UK than it is in the Netherlands, but it certainly is a factor here. There's bias by geography. Universities in other parts of the world, in the southern hemisphere, or even universities in the north of England versus the south of England may have a different brand name attached to them, which could actually influence the academics who work there. And there is some evidence your papers get accepted more easily than when you're at a different university. I think there is enough data there to say that there's also bias by geography. Status of the institution, and clearly there are links here. There's intersectionality because geography and status of the institution are also closely linked. I mean, most of the top 100 universities in any kind of ranking are not in Africa. They're in Western Europe, in Canada, in the US, also increasingly in Asia, but there definitely is a bias towards status of institution. And I hesitate to put it on there, but I did it anyway, field of research. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the STEM fields are considered real science, and that social sciences and humanities are often considered a little less important. And certainly when we look at where the funding goes, the majority of the global funding goes to STEM research. And you could say that's more expensive because there's more lab involved, etc. But I think there's also a way of looking at real research versus maybe not so real research. But I find it difficult to say because there's no proof. It's just my impression. And this is something we could definitely talk about when I'm done with this presentation. working. I'm trying very hard. I'm pretty sure I'm pushing the right button. I can also just forward it like this.
Just tell me now, pressing on.
Yeah, no, I should have used the left one. I think there's one before this one. No, there isn't. Okay. So today I'm not going to talk about bias in promotions. I'm not going to talk about bias in careers, basically everything that the pledge talks about. I want to very briefly say something about bias in peer review, and then I want to go on to bias in knowledge production. So bias in peer review is also being researched quite heavily in the last few years, and particularly gender bias in peer review. And there's mounting evidence that in publications, the chances of women to get published are slightly lower than the chances of men to get published. Chances of female first authors to get cited are lower than chances of male first authors to get cited. And also in funding, there's evidence from ERC and some national funding agencies that women consistently have a slightly lower chance of getting their proposals funded. And it's not that much, it's often a few percentage points, but we also shouldn't forget that many molehills make one big mountain, and it's important to realize that even in those seemingly meritocratic procedures, there is a chance that bias creeps in. And I'm putting it up here because peer review is so at the heart of our academic careers. So internally, universities use the external ways of valuing research and granting proposals as a way to also define their internal job opportunities for young and not so young staff. And because of the way we're doing it, we're actually giving a lot of our power to other bodies. Shall I try and see whether it works? No. Can you do it? Right. No, that's the previous one. Yeah, there we go. So what university leaders tell their young researchers is important, namely teamwork and collaboration. It's not just about you, it's about the university, it's about your team, it's about all your colleagues around you. Multidisciplinary work, we can't solve the global challenges without a multidisciplinary angle on things, so make sure that you really do that and you work together with many different disciplines. Societal impact's increasingly important for the ref, but also for university leaders. So we tell our young staff to make sure that what they do is societally relevant, and we also tell them that teaching is very important because we're training the next generation of global citizens. And if we are at a research-intensive university, we want to think about how to make sure that our wonderful research actually also goes straight into the classrooms and that our students are involved in what we're doing. And I think we really mean it when we say that, but the problem is that a lot of the ways that universities are also being ranked are around the slide I just showed you. So in reality, and this is a bit of an exaggeration, but I think I can show you can show the next slide now. What we're actually teaching young staff is to be very competitive, and that's certainly something that's not unfamiliar to Imperial, the competition, to focus on their own CV in terms of how many grants they can bring in, publications and authorship, to not focus too much on multidisciplinary work. Sometimes it's actually really hard to get that in the right journals. A lot of journals don't have the reviewers who understand true multi and interdisciplinary work, so it can be harder to get it published. Societal impact, of course, it's important, but if you really want to focus on your CV, make sure that you publish in stellar journals first and then think about societal impact. And teaching, of course, it's important, but maybe not as important as research. And again, this is an exaggeration, but I think that you probably recognize some of it. And this really gets in the way when we're thinking about more inclusive research. That's why I wanted to spend a bit of time on it. Next one. So what are we talking about when we're talking about inclusive research and innovation? It's the kind of research and innovation that's for everybody, not just for a relatively small subgroup of the global population. And we need to focus on what actually happens with our research, who uses it, how does it get implemented, does it really get used for the betterment of as large a subgroup of our population as possible. And if we do that well, we actually will have global research that's more vital, that is of higher quality, and that's certainly much more impactful than when we don't think about the uptake of our research. And we should never forget that our interventions and our solutions and innovations, they're only as successful as the people who want to use them. About 75% of innovations that are successful actually are successful because of the uptake, because of the populations that use them, that work with them. And we need to constantly think about making that as equitable as possible, doing responsible innovation so it's for as large a group in the population as possible. And doing innovation that doesn't increase inequalities that are already existing. So if we do it well, it eliminates the biases that exist, and it can enhance the equality, and eventually it can save lives and money. And I now want to march you through some examples so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. And I want to talk to you about cardiovascular disease, about test crash dummies, some other things, climate change, and then hopefully you'll get a better picture of what we're talking about. So next slide, please, Dot. So ischemic heart disease, it's a very interesting example, and it's one that's being embraced now by many medics, that there actually are huge differences in men and women. The pathology and symptoms of heart disease are not always the same for men and women. Women, as a consequence of that, are mis- and underdiagnosed more than men are. And at the same time, ischemic heart disease is a major killer in women globally. It's the #1 cause of death globally, also in the global south. And the problem with the fact that we just, in the beginning, didn't accrue enough knowledge around heart disease in women is that now the evidence-based standards are much more based on male than female pathophysiology. And it's important to make it complicated to look at both sex and gender differences. So when we're saying sex differences, we mean DNA. We mean the fact that women by biology are capable of actually becoming pregnant and having babies, and their physiology, their hormonal equilibrium is different than that in men. So that's sex. Basically, you can distinguish more, most of the population can distinguish XX and XY chromosomes and their physiological differences in men and women. And a lot of those physiological differences lie at the root of the fact that ischemic heart disease is different in men than in women. But there are also gender differences. There may be differences in rates of obesity and smoking and lifestyle issues, in how often people actually consult with physicians, how physicians look at men and women maybe differently. And the problem with ischemic heart disease is that forever, for decades, the populations that were being studied were male. So the Framingham study, large US and European studies, they basically looked at men. And so everybody thought that heart attacks were a male disease. And it took quite a while to understand that women also die of ischemic heart disease, and that their symptoms and the diagnostic tools that should be used are different. So even today, women die because of the fact that we haven't really gotten our act together for ischemic heart disease in women as we have in men. It's rapidly changing because a lot of time and effort is now put into this. But I think it's a really good example of how you, when you don't think about it, you totally miss half of the population. This is one that's close to my heart from my maternal and child health perspective. It's about crash test dummies. In 1948, the first test dummy was invented. His name was Sierra Sam, and it was in the US Air Force. And from that came test dummies that were used in car crashes. So automobile producers like General Motors started, and in 1972 they developed a hybrid test dummy which was sort of the 50th percentile male, and they didn't really develop any particular female or younger dummies until the 80s and 90s, when test dummies started to appear that were looking like infants and children, and more diverse groups, not necessarily the 50th percentile American male, meaning white American male. But it wasn't until 1996 when the first pregnant crash test dummy was developed, and was aptly called the MAMA 2B, and MAMA is for maternal anthropomorphic measuring appliance. That's what it is. I don't know why it's 2B. They probably had a 1A and 2A. And in 2002, Volvo developed a virtual pregnant dummy, which actually really does simulate a lot of the real-life features of pregnant women. And pregnant women drive cars, and actually fetal death through car accidents is the most frequent fetal death that's not because of a chronic disease in the mother. So unborn babies lose their lives in car crashes. And up to 2017, pregnant dummies or simulations like Linda, the Volvo virtual pregnant dummy, are still not government mandated. So we still have a situation where lots of pregnant women are driving. They're using the 3-point seat belts, which is probably not the best seat belt for every pregnant woman. And there are tests being done with different types of seat belts, but they haven't really been evidence-based enough. I think that's pretty fascinating from an engineering perspective. And I thought, what are other examples that may appeal to a crowd like this at Imperial? A recent article around gender bias and algorithms from the Boston University and Stanford shows that when large data sets contain social bias, the machines who deal with those data sets and create artificial intelligence quickly copy that bias and actually can make it worse. So at Stanford, they figured out that if you start asking a machine that's sort of learning, and apparently computers are a bit like babies, when you give them a big data set, they have to learn how to deal with it. So often word embeddings are being used to look at which words are most closely together. So what these people did is they used a Google data set, a Google News data set, and then looked at which words are closely aligned in lots of news items. And at some point, they looked at he is to computer programming as she is to, and I'll show you on the next slide which the answer was. And it's totally okay when he is to king and she is to queen is what the computer comes back with. But this computer came back with some categories that may not be so okay. So if you can show us the next slide, Dot. So homemaker is to woman what computer programming is to men, according to this computer, which hadn't been trained to circumvent the bias. There's doctor, nurse, brilliant, lovely, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, architect, interior designer, and one of my favorites, blonde and burly. I thought that was really interesting. And the computer isn't biased. He, she, I don't even know what gender a computer is, doesn't know. They're just looking for which categories are most frequently brought together. And of course, this is not a neutral thing, because if you use an algorithm like this to, for instance, find advertisements for computer programmers, and they constantly miss computer programmers called Linda or Sheila because they think that they're homemakers, then that could actually influence careers of people. So now the engineers are looking at other biases, also in ethnic minority names, and maybe other phenomena that we need to look at. And they found a way to also neutralize the gender bias. But you need to be aware. You need to ask yourself those kinds of questions before you can stumble upon these phenomena. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the bigger global issues, like the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations has defined in 2015, I believe it is, around issues that concern us all. And one of the major ones is climate change. And there's a lot of research that's being done at Imperial around this topic, and clearly many, many research universities around the globe are focusing on how to deal with climate change. And also in climate change, there is a difference. Different genders are affected differently. Women are disproportionately affected by climate change, and that's for many, many reasons, and I just listed a few of them. And especially in the poorer countries, sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, women and girls are more often responsible for water gathering. So the less water there is, the further they have to walk. And it's actually impacting on the time that girls can spend on going to school and on homework. They have less time because they're more busy with water gathering if there are periods of extreme drought. Women and girls suffer more in times of food shortage. Often the boys and the men are fed before the women and the girls. The majority of poor farmers, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are women, and they're very severely impacted by climate change. And the other side of the coin, the extreme floods, women are more likely to die in floods, often because they're not prioritized, but also because fewer women can swim in countries that are likely to be flooded in these kinds of situations. And we should never forget that women are also very important agents of change. So if you actually do work with women in countries that are very severely impacted by climate change, there are also ways of changing the situation around and making sure that more people are benefiting from the measures that may be put in place. And this, I wanted to show you this because the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, actually for all their subsidies and their grants that they give to agencies who work in Africa, are now asking for people who put the proposals in that they think about gender responsive proposals. And they're doing that also because they have noticed that they're spending a lot of money on interventions that actually don't work if you don't draw women in. There have been drought-resistant food crops which were impossible to cook with and that women eventually didn't really want to use. There have been lots of other projects where the people who put them in place are the males in charge of the villages or the regions, and they don't think about the actual food producers and the people growing the crops. So Bill and Melinda Gates have figured out that if they get women in from the get-go, their projects are much more likely to succeed and benefit larger groups of people. And of course, we should never forget that women are also mostly in charge of raising children. So healthy women are more likely to produce healthy children, which is the whole next generation, boys and girls. Refugees, I thought it was an important topic to briefly discuss, especially in this political climate and with the big refugee crisis that's going on right now. 50% of global refugees are women, and there are millions of people who are refugees or displaced. And in crises, and there's a lot of literature around this, gender inequalities are often exacerbated. So there are higher levels of gender-based violence in crisis situations, in refugee camps, or actually being on the road. Women are often much more vulnerable to violence than men are. Women are more likely to be excluded from certain services, like food services, like health services, because of the social norms, because they literally sometimes have to stand in the back of the line when people are lining up. And women are more often limited in their mobility because of all the threats that they're facing that may not be the same for men. So they're disproportionately affected, and often they're also slower because they take care of their young children. And only 4% of the UN interagency appeals that come in when there's a big crisis and agencies are asking the UN for combined money-raising efforts, only 4% are targeted specifically at women and girls. So often we're not thinking about looking at them separately. Next one, please. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 in all. And number 5 is actually explicitly gender equality, but in every goal, literally every one of the 17 goals, it's very important to think about how all the measures may impact women differently than men. And it's becoming, it's coming, and lots of parties are becoming more aware, but it's not structural enough, and it's very important that we keep thinking about this. So whatever it is we're trying to do, whether it's looking at the economy or transportation or education, think about whether there are effects of gender and make sure that we take them into account when we design interventions. Next one, please. So now I wanted to give you a few other examples a little closer to home. These are from a LERU report, League of European Research Universities, on gendered research and innovation. And I was one of the writers, the authors of that report. It came out, I think, a year and a half ago now. And we went around to all LERU universities. There actually, unfortunately, weren't examples from Imperial, but I'm sure there are, so I hope we can find them after my lecture. But some came up from the different universities, which I thought were worth sharing with you. And this one is interesting because here young men are actually affected by the fact that we don't think about them as an important group. And this was a study into eating disorders. And it turns out that more and more young men actually have eating disorders, but we think about it as a very female disease. So it takes longer for a young man to be diagnosed, to get the help and the support they need. They're often underdiagnosed and undertreated for anorexia and other eating disorders, despite the fact that they're now making up a quarter of the cases. So not thinking about inclusive design can also be a problem for men. It's not only the women that will suffer from it. And this one, I just think it's really cute. It's from my old university, and it's not unimportant, but it's also, I think it's a nice example. It's where biologists have long thought that birds, only male birds sing, but the group of biologists at Leiden University actually studied from a quite different perspective and with a larger database, and they asked different questions, and it was found out that female birds actually sing much more than we have previously thought, and it's important for territorium, for offspring. So it's not that they're not just doing it because they feel like it, but it's really important from a biological perspective. And no one really knew before this study, and there have been a few follow-up studies. So just because they asked themselves the question, they came up with this. And a third example from the report I wanted to show you is heart disease, which I talked about as the first example. There was a whole issue of a journal on atherosclerosis that was devoted to sex and gender issues. It was aptly titled Sex Matters to the Heart, which I think is quite a fun title. But what they looked at was very serious. In-depth study of sex-specific biomarkers to make diagnostics better, and much better risk prediction of cardiovascular disease for women. So among cardiologists, this is now no longer something that they need to think about, should we do this? It's become common practice. It's actually bad medicine if you don't think about women as a separate group. Next, please. And I want to show you a screenshot of this website. Please visit it if you feel inspired by this lecture. This is from Stanford, Landa Schiebinger. She's actually from the humanities, but she's devoted the last 10 years of her career to this topic, gendered research and innovation. And she has a website, she built it with lots of researchers, lots of case studies, where you can actually also find methodologies and think about how would you do this, what does it mean for design, for data analysis, for implementation of your research. And there are wonderful case studies there. One is on stem cells, where it turns out a group of researchers in the lab actually killed off half their mice population, namely all the males, because they didn't realize that in transplantation of stem cells, bone marrow stem cells, sex was important, the sex of the cells. So they injected female stem cells into male mice. At first they didn't know, they didn't understand why all the male mice were dying. And they've now rectified that. Second example is interesting too. Osteoporosis is still thought of as a predominantly female disease. Well, men also get osteoporosis, slightly older age than women. So many older men who fall and break something don't get recognized as having osteoporosis because the people themselves and clinicians don't immediately think about it that way. And the third example is about HIV microbicides. And it's interesting, it's from a lab in Berkeley, a guy called Andrew Zeri, who actually is an engineer and who changed his applied physics course into biomedical engineering. And he started looking at applications of microfluidic physics theories and models to real-life situations, and found that while doing that, he was drawing many, many more young women into his lab. So the average PhD ratio men-women in the US is about 15% women, 85% men. And in his lab, it's 50-50 now. And this particular example is actually very interesting, where they were trying to find a gel that could be used by women in sub-Saharan Africa who often can't say no to sex. That's how they phrase it on their website. So I'll repeat it that neutrally, to make sure that if they use that gel, they can actually prevent being infected with HIV. And it's really interesting what he's done, just changing the topic of his research and also change the makeup of his team in his lab. So it's a worthwhile case to study, especially from the engineering and STEM perspective at Imperial. Next one, please. And I promised I would also say something about other identities than gender. And I'm picking this example because, again, there's a lot of literature about this particular topic, ethnic minorities and how they're being treated in healthcare. There was a landmark publication, which is still absolutely worth reading, from the Institutes of Medicine in the US. You see a picture of it up at the left corner. That basically, it's called Unequal Treatment, and it's a meta-analysis of a lot of the research showing that there is implicit bias in hospitals in the way patients get treated. And it's not just that, we all know that certain subgroups of patients, especially poorer patients, don't have access to healthcare as easily, especially in the US, of course, that's a major problem. But this was also predominantly around people who were in hospital and how they get treated differently. And some of the studies have even been done with actors who are black or Hispanic or white and who present with certain symptoms, and there is a difference in the kinds of treatments that they get offered and the way they're being treated just by their skin color. And there are many factors at play, but it's very difficult not to conclude that implicit bias is a big part of it. So everybody is biased, and I think if anything, I really want to get that across. I'm biased too. I'm actually super sexist, and lots of people think when I say that I mean I favor women over men. That's not true. I favor men over women. I've done lots of tests, and it's shocking, and I really don't like it, but it's the way it is. And it's because I've grown up in the Netherlands, where there's a very clear culture that women are predominantly mothers and caretakers, and men are predominantly workers. So if I'm not careful, I will think that an average male candidate is a better leader than an average female candidate. And yeah, that's just how it is. We all have biases. So even doctors and nurses have biases, even judges do, even academics do. And I think we need to embrace that notion. The next step is important. If we keep denying it, then we'll never be able to rectify it. So many factors are at play here, including implicit bias. And I want to show you one particular study that has really shocked a lot of people. I don't know if you can read it. Is it clear enough? This is about black versus white children with appendicitis in a large number of hospitals during quite a long period of time in the US. There was a study, I think, on the East Coast. I can get you the reference if you want it. It's from the Journal of the American Medical Association. And what turned out is that the best way of treating pain is opioid analgesia. And it's especially in children. So here on the left you see moderate pain, and on the right you see severe pain. And in all cases, the black children were less likely to be offered the right analgesic, and they corrected for many other factors. So it was by level of pain and by quite a few other things. So these were children who came into hospital for appendicitis. And for some reason, and the authors don't really know what it is either, although they're assuming that here too bias is at play, black children were not offered the right amount and the right type of pain killing as often as white children were. And it's those kinds of studies that I think are really worth looking at instead of dismissing, just wondering what's going on. And there may be lots of things going on, but clearly this must be some kind of bias. Next one, please. And I think it also has to do with the fact that there's clear inequality in the caregivers, just like we know that there are very few black and ethnic minority professors in universities in the US and in the UK and in many other Western countries. There are also very few black doctors comparatively. This is a graph from the US. I couldn't find data on the UK. I'm sure they're around, but I just wasn't able to find them for today. And you see that the percentage of especially black men and black women, this is doctors, so the percentage of physicians over the years from 1980 to 2012. And you can see that there are more white women going into medicine, there are more Asian women and men going into medicine, but black men, black women, and Native American men and women have stayed pretty stagnant. So in the caregivers, there are very few, even though a lot of the patients are black and ethnic minorities in the UK, in the US, in many European countries, the caregivers still are predominantly white. And that may be one of the reasons why bias actually does enter into the patient-doctor situation. So what are the factors that may play a role in bias in knowledge production, in how we do our science, in the kinds of questions we ask, and whether we wonder whether we treat subgroups of people equally well as the norm group? I think there's a problem with the relative invisibility of the group, that we don't consider the norm. We just don't really think about it, we just assume. Like in medicine, it's been assumed for so long that women are just small men, and we don't have to do anything different. And I think it also has to do with the fact that the people who are at the table, who decide which studies to run and where to put the money, more often are white and male than the populations that we're doing the work for. There's also stereotyping going on. It's not easy to decide how to do your research more inclusive and how to look at men and women, because it's very easy to fall into the trap of stereotyping. Like, men don't have eating disorders, women think a certain way, have certain talents that men don't have. So you have to know what you're doing, and there's clearly quite a bit of stereotyping still going on. There's still a stereotypical view, at least in parents, that girls are not as good at maths as boys are, and that no doubt also goes into how we think about the knowledge we want to build. There's a built-in privilege for the norm group because they're more often at the table, they're more often leadership positions, and everybody brings their own background to the decision-making table. We're not neutral, we're all people, even though physics may be neutral and particles may be neutral. When we're doing research in any of those areas, we're people with our own backgrounds. There may be a judgment about the value of other type of knowledge. That's very obvious in, for instance, looking at indigenous populations and their needs in all kinds of different areas, that often in countries that have large indigenous populations, they're not part of the research agenda, they're also not at the decision-making table. And a lot of their knowledge is considered not as good as the knowledge that's being produced in universities. And it may be true that some of the cultures are not as evidence-based as they could be, but it also means that a lot of the wisdom and the knowledge that is out there, and a lot of ways of actually connecting with one another that may make the research more applicable, are being missed. And I'm sure there are various other mechanisms of bias and or exclusion, and I'd actually love to hear your thoughts about it. And now,
See this and you
sorry,
wonder,
can you stop
did
just
he
for a
lose his
second? I'm
key?
doing exactly what I wasn't going to do. I'm going to show you a video. It's 4 minutes and some. It's 3 actors who are trying to steal a bicycle. It's an ABC program. It's called What Would You Do? Who have seen it? Okay, not too many. That's good. And it basically just talks about the implicit bias that we all have. But it's a great, very clear example. So would you roll it, Dorothy?
You see this and you wonder, did he lose his keys or is he blatantly stealing that bike? In broad daylight, he hammers and then saws on the chain. When that doesn't work, he pulls out an industrial-sized bolt cutter. And when he's asked, he fesses up.
You lost the lock?
No, not exactly.
But he's not a real thief. Justin Kelly is an actor, and our hidden cameras are rolling.
What happened? Nothing. I can't get through the lock. I mean, I know this is weird, but you wouldn't happen to know whose bike this is.
Yeah.
All right, good. Thank you.
It was odd that somebody had all that equipment.
But you didn't do anything.
No.
That's true.
That's the bottom line.
Lots of people stop and stare. A few even question the actor.
I guess I have to ask, is that your bike?
I guess technically no.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Good luck.
In over an hour, about 100 people pass by. Only George and Arlene try to stop him. Some tell us they plan to call the police later. Others say they're scared. Keep moving. This woman and her friends give our thief the benefit of the doubt. When we ask why, Bisa Washington tells us first impressions matter.
I remember thinking young white men don't usually carry burglar tools.
So we all make assumptions, huh?
Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe he works for the park.
We replace our white thief with this young man, Matlock. Remember, both actors dress in a similar way and are about the same age.
Is that your bike?
Nah.
Then what are you cutting the chain for?
Right away. Right away, somebody yelled. Wow. Within seconds, another person confronts our thief.
Is that your bike?
Technically, it's not, but it's gonna be mine.
More people converge.
Does anyone have a cell phone? Will you call the police? He's like stealing somebody's bike.
Oh, you taking that bike? Is that your bike?
No, it's not, sir.
Oh, why are you doing that?
Is this any of y'all bikes? Is this your bike?
It's not, it belongs,
No, but whoever's it is.
It belongs to someone.
To who?
Well, not to you.
And sure enough, one man whips out a cell phone to call 911.
Yeah, there's someone taking a bike here.
Our actor triggers more reaction. Some people are even snapping pictures for evidence.
I got you, bud. I got you.
This guy's stealing a bike. Whose bike's over here?
Once everyone moves away, we reset our cameras. And within minutes, another outraged man is yelling.
Are you trying to steal that bike?
Excuse me, sir, but the bike's been here for days. Like, no one's gonna take it.
Well, that's not your bike then.
Yeah,
you can't just come in and take something from somebody.
Excuse me, sir. I'm
okay, I'll just take your tools away then. This yours, sir?
Please, sir, don't touch my stuff, sir. Please, sir, do not touch my stuff.
Well, you're
please.
touching somebody else's stuff.
Yeah, all right, but this has been here. Like, who's gonna take it?
Well, that doesn't make it your property.
Technically, it does.
No, it doesn't technically. It's not yours to take.
All right, sir.
When we bring out our cameras, David Robb wants us to go after the thief.
That kid in the red shirt.
He's hacking away at a bike that's not his.
Days, and he has a right to take it and steal it. And he's come here with...
She may not look like your average bike thief, but actress Ashley Carpenter makes sure anyone who asks knows she's up to no good.
Need a hand?
You don't know whose this is, do you?
Whose bike it is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With a little help from Ed Fitzsimmons, the bike chain easily falls away.
Yup, everywhere. Oh my goodness, what a strong man you are.
And he isn't the only man who stops in his tracks. What's this guy thinking?
You know, you pull up, you don't know if she lost her key, if she's trying to actually take the bike, but then again, she's a girl. And would you ever see a girl doing that?
Steal?
You never know. Most of the times it's a guy gonna do something like that.
Reginald pedals right past his appalled wife, straight to our actress, asking her if she needs a hand.
Okay, I'll eventually get it.
I did some time in Rollway. I can steal this.
Oh, you can steal it? Maybe you can help me steal it.
So I think this is implicit bias at play. There are many examples like this, test situations where things like this have been enacted, and we all do this. It's just how we've been brought up. And I think it's very important that we realize it, and it doesn't just impact on how we deal with promotions and with selection, but also how we think about what's valuable science. And it's so much easier to think about things from our own perspective than to think about them from someone else's perspective. And one term that's going around a lot is white privilege, and I find that very useful. I actually had a colleague in my previous job who's an organizational psychologist, and who said it's not that people want to discriminate, it's just easier to help someone to think about someone's benefit who's like you, and I think we all do that. But some of these stereotypes clearly are so prevalent that even the two black women thought that the white boy wasn't stealing and probably would have thought the black boy was. So we're all doing it. There are no villains and heroes in stories like this. So I'm almost done. I just want to show you a few more. This is a movie that I haven't seen yet, but I think it's great, Hidden Figures. It's about 3 black women that were absolutely crucial at putting John Glenn in orbit around the Earth at NASA. It's a real story. It hasn't been told enough. It's so important for young black women to have role models. It's important for all of us to have role models. What you can't see, you can't be. So we need to make sure that we have more people doing research who are not your stereotypical researcher, to also change the content of our knowledge production. So to wrap up, why do we need global change in knowledge production? There's no systematic consideration and mainstreaming of inclusive thinking in the research process. And especially at the question asking phase, at the funding phase, we need to ask ourselves these very probing questions much more. Who is this going to benefit? Are we thinking inclusive? Is there a difference in ethnic groups, in men and women? Because that also impacts on how we actually carry out our studies and which populations we study. And there's huge lack of awareness, both in researchers, university leaders, policymakers, politicians, research funders, journal editors. There are quite a few medical journals that will now ask for a gendered analysis. And there are funders who ask for ethnicity and gender to be taken into account, especially Canada is really far ahead of a lot of us. The US is changing, but it's certainly globally not mainstreamed. This is my before the last one. So how do we do this? How can we reach this? I think it's important to integrate the gender and inclusivity perspective in all phases, but especially when we're asking ourselves the questions. Pay attention to intersectionality. Not everybody is either black or white. People have different identities. So you can be a black woman, you can be a white homosexual Muslim, and that of course makes everything more complicated, but life is complicated, and I think that's also part of the richness of our human experience. It's important to avoid bias and also stereotyping and non-evidence-based assumptions about other people, and understand the role of social sciences and humanities. I think we need to work together with people who understand gender, who understand poverty, who understand different ethnicities. And that means stimulating multidisciplinarity. But it will also probably draw different groups into science. I think one of the reasons that science, engineering particularly, is still so white and male is also because of the kinds of knowledge it produces. And then my last slide, Mao Zedong said women hold up half the sky, and I added they deserve half the research. So this is what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.
I think we're very, very short on time.
Yeah, sorry I took so long.
Well, I think it was very interesting. So, I will ask Nick Jennings, Vice Provost for Research, who more appropriate to say thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Simone. As was said, my name's Nick Jennings, and I'm the Vice Provost for Research. It was a really fascinating and thoughtful lecture, Simone. You sort of highlighted a number of things that actually I hadn't particularly thought of myself as well. So I assume many in the audience felt exactly the same. This is a really important issue for the college. That's why we have it this week, and that's what we're trying to do all the way from the top, to really think about diversity issues. For me, it's important in a basic fairness perspective, but also it leads, I think, to better research. I think, there are a number of good examples there where actually thinking about different forms of diversity leads to you thinking and coming up with different answers in research. And so it's sort of also leads us to higher quality work in what we do. So would you join me in thanking Simone for an excellent and thoughtful lecture? Thank you, Simone.
I still have some time. I hope if you don't have to rush off, it would be good to have some discussion. Okay. I'm really sorry. We started a bit later, and I carried on a bit longer than I thought I would.
Can I tell you about the